Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where you're joining us from today. I'd like to welcome you to Trend Micro's Internet Safety for Kids and Families program webinar series. This is actually our Managing Family Life Online series that we started almost 1 year ago today. And our topic will be on bullying and hate and how we can teach our kids to be resilient, how to respond, and how to be a good ally. A couple of things before we get started. I'd first like to encourage those of you who are joining us on Zoom to use the Q&A function at any time during today's conversation, and we will make time to address your questions. I'd also like to invite those who are watching us on Facebook to submit your questions in the Facebook comments, and our team will make sure that we are able to access those and hopefully answer those for you as well. And finally, I'd like to thank our interpreters from the Learning Center for the Deaf, Veronica Berry and Noelle Lobo. With that, just a few more comments, and then I'd like to invite our guests for today. The first is that we're really grateful that technology has enabled us to continue our work with Trend Micro's Internet Safety for Kids and Families program. Most of what we had done prior to the pandemic was in person, visiting communities of parents and classrooms of students that obviously we could no longer do a year ago. And in addition to being grateful for the technology that allows us to continue this work, we're grateful for all of the experts that have been joining us throughout our series, sharing their insights, giving their advice, and really helping us through this most difficult year on a range of topics that have challenged us as families using technology to the best of our abilities. So with that, I would like to introduce our guests for today. We have Dr. Samir Hinduja and Dr. Justin Patchin, who are co-founders of the Cyberbullying Research Center, but they each are also busy and in the middle of their academic years as they're each professors at separate universities. Florida Atlantic University for Dr. Hinduja and University of Wisconsin at, it's Eau-Claire, is that right? Dr. Patchin, yes, in Wisconsin. So welcome.
Thanks, Lynette. We appreciate it. We always love chatting with you about these issues.
Absolutely. And so why don't you give us, for our audience who did not get a chance to ever hear from you previously, can you tell us a little bit about the center and give us maybe a highlight of what's been different for you since we last spoke a year ago?
Yeah, so at the Cyberbullying Research Center, Samir and I study how teens use and misuse technology. So it's basically a research collaborative. He and I met in graduate school in the dark ages and identified this sort of lack of knowledge regarding what young people were doing online and some of the problems they were encountering. So we're all about kind of evidence-based decision making. And so it's important to gather information directly from youth. And so we survey middle and high school age students fairly regularly, maybe every couple of years or so. This past year, we surveyed tweens, 9 to 12-year-olds, and we ask about what they're confronting online. And we try to translate what we learn in that research into resources for parents and educators and others who work with kids, and even the young people themselves. We want to try to empower them to address these issues and make their online experiences more kind and more beneficial and less harmful and less interrupted by the problems that can really come up. And so since last year, like I said, we did a national study in the US on tween cyberbullying. We partnered with Cartoon Network on that. We're continuing to hopefully collect data here very shortly to try to get an answer to a question that Samir and I have been asked probably 17,000 times since you and I last chatted, and that's whether or not cyberbullying has increased during the pandemic as more kids are spending more time online. And the short answer to that is we don't know. But the longer answer is we're trying to find out. So we're trying to collect some data here shortly to see what's been going on over the last year. And we're continuing to keep up with other trends and apps and laws and other developments and try to translate those things again into resources that people can use.
And just to piggyback on that, we do take a lot of pride in the resources that we create and are constantly building and then sending out to deploying to everyone. We're trying to serve, of course, parents for so many years and educators and mental health professionals and law enforcement personnel, and of course, students, whether they're in elementary, middle, or high school. And so there's always going to be a need, I think, when it comes to best practices, when it comes to prevention and response. And we hope that we're filling a gap, but we also know that there's other amazing people out there who are co-laboring with us on all of that. The other thing that I wanted to say is that we have, Lynette, as you know, a limited amount of time together. And so another thing that we pride ourselves on, apart from quality resources, is getting back to people if they need any sort of assistance or follow-up. And so let's say that we get into a specific topic, but we don't go into it in detail or in as much length as we could. Well, I want your audience to know that Justin and I will get back to them if they reach out. Lynette, I know that you would get back to individuals if they reach out to you as well. So bottom line, we're here as a continual resource for anyone when it comes to these issues at the intersection of youth and tech and social media.
Absolutely. And I know that you have been, your reputation precedes you on that. I know you get quite a few inbound inquiries into the center about, issues that are arising for specific families or youth, schools who are struggling with how to deal with a particular incidents in their community and so on. So you're really you've got a finger on the pulse of what's going on, but we do appreciate the academic rigor that you're also applying to this, because I think it's too easy on a topic like bullying, which is so emotional, for people to want to be prescriptive simply by a reflex. Whatever your instinct tells you should do, you should do. And that may or may not be the best response. I want to turn a little bit towards, I think, an issue, actually the title of today's session, which was consciously listing bullying and hate separately. And I think it would be really good for the audience to understand clearly what the differences between these are from a legal and academic definitions, but also what the differences are in terms of those who are victims of these each. So can you first explain the difference between bullying and hate online, and then what are the differences in terms of those who experience it?
Sure, I'll take a stab, Justin, and of course, jump in whenever. But when it comes to traditional definitions of school-based bullying, there's certain elements that are constant. For example, the behavior has to be hurtful and intentional. There has to be some sort of articulable harm that the target is able to express. There's a concept of repetition where it's not just a one-off incident, but it's over and over again. And so that contributes to the fear and the intimidation of it all. And then finally, there's usually some sort of power imbalance, and that could be physical, but it also could be social, could be intellectual. There's a number of power differentials that can take place. When it comes to hate speech specifically, we're focused, of course, on speech where you're targeting an individual or a group of individuals because of who they are. And of course, that's tied into their identity. And so any language, any expressions that denigrate them or that incites or encourage violence against them, that would be characterized as hate speech. When it comes to the repercussions, we know that bullying affects individuals in different ways. Some of it can be easily shrugged off, and I know we'll talk about resilience a little bit later. Some of it cuts deeply depending on your specific sensitivities and maybe the insidious nature of it. when I think of, identity-based bullying and, these forms of hate speech that we're seeing in greater frequency, I think that has a weight of its own simply because it's tied to characteristics about yourself that you can't change. It's, again, intrinsic to who you are. I'm obviously Asian Indian, and I can't change that. And to be singled out and targeted for violence to be encouraged against me because of that, I just think that it takes a deeper, or it causes a deeper level of victimization and pain.
Just to add on to that, I think it's important to point out that actually hate speech isn't a crime. Hate behavior is, and certainly threats towards somebody based on who they are would be a crime. But hate speech in and of itself in the US is not a crime. And in some ways, that's a good parallel to bullying, because most bullying behaviors don't reach the level of being a crime. And yet, I think we as a society would like to see less of both, right? So are there things we can do, ways that, for example, schools or parents or communities can address these behaviors outside of the formal criminal justice system? Because the vast majority of all Americans, I believe, don't see a place for hate anywhere within our society, in schools, in communities, and especially as it relates to one's identity.
So do these differences between the two, because they are distinctly different, as you described, do they also dictate the way that a school community might have to respond to them? Or would the response be pretty much the same?
Well, it does. I mean, generally, I think the school should respond in the same way. What I would say, and the reason I hesitate, is from a legal standpoint, the schools probably have more obligation to intervene in instances where somebody is being targeted because of their race or their gender or their sexual orientation or some other protected class like a disability. So there's a lot of case law surrounding situations where schools have failed to respond to those types of incidents, and schools have gotten into trouble. Now, I would argue that schools are obligated to intervene in all instances of mistreatment, of harassment, of abuse, just that the courts are a little bit clearer in terms of the role that the school has to play in maintaining a safe learning environment, and one that's free from discrimination based on some of these characteristics. So that aside, so there might be a greater demand to respond to some of those kinds of behaviors. That aside, I think the response would be the same. And we could spend a whole series of webinars talking about what that response might look like. But the ultimate point is to get those behaviors to stop. And so school officials need to work with parents, families, and others potentially to figure out what in this particular situation needs to happen among these particular individuals involved to get that behavior to stop. And it might be a formal response, like a detention or a suspension or something like that, but it might simply be calling the individual into the counselor's office and having a conversation with them about the words they use and how they approach certain people. And because especially I think for the younger populations, let's say upper elementary and middle school, I've seen many examples where kids use certain terms that they really shouldn't, or call people certain names that could be derogatory based on an identity feature. And they just don't understand it. They don't understand how they're using it. They don't understand the harm associated with it. So making sure that there's, taking advantage of that teachable moment and kind of educating kids about these kinds of effects. And so I think schools, again, need to be more kind of thoughtful about how to respond to these things instead of simply, expelling a kid or suspending them for a long period of time. Ultimately, you want to get to the kind of root cause of what sparked that behavior.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think there are great examples of school districts trying to start, as you say, the root cause. Are we a breeding ground that allows hate to thrive, or one that doesn't allow hate to thrive? And so school culture becomes pretty paramount in that effort to minimize incidences of bullying and hate. I think what's interesting is we haven't been in school. The kids have largely over the course of the year either been in a hybrid situation or at home. And even those who were going in a hybrid situation may have been in reduced hours. And so kids really didn't experience school the way they normally experience school this past year. And yet we know with the current conversations around social justice and fights against racism towards many groups of people, but more recently around the Asian and Pacific Islander communities, that there have been quite a few incidences, some of which were online, reported by the Stop AAPI Coalition, and the great work that they've been doing and sounding the alarm that they've been doing for the past year with regard to hate directed towards Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. And in a study they did specifically for youth, I believe this was just over a 4-month period between March and July of 2020. All of these are self-reported, 341 youth out of a total of 2,500 reports, but 341 were from youth, reported incidences. And what's interesting about those is a good percentage of them were online. They were more likely to experience it online versus adults. And a great percentage of them, 60%, were adults harassing youth. This is interesting because when we think about online bullying in kids, we very often think it's peer to peer. You know, one kid being mean to another kid or a group of kids targeting another kid. But in this case, this was adults targeting youth. I'd just like to get your perspective on generally about what's been going on with the Asian American community, and then specifically on adult-directed hate or bullying towards youth.
Yeah, it's kind of a startling finding that you raised there, and it is abnormal. It is unusual for adults to be targeting kids like that. I mean, in almost all of our research, we see peer kind of behavior. Of course, you know, it kind of brings me back to the Megan Meyer incident from 20 years ago, 15 years ago. I don't remember, with Lori Drew targeting her. And then the case in Pennsylvania with the deep fakes that we can talk about more later. And so I think these incidents where adults are behaving badly, it just shows how far we've fallen. And it also, you know, I would love to get in the head of that adult, you know, that does that kind of thing. I would love to have a conversation with them about why, and is it just typical kind of trolling behavior, and this is the first, you know, person they came upon in terms of being a victim, because typically with bullying there's a relationship between the aggressor and the target, usually based on school, but maybe some other connection. I suspect that in many cases with these adults doing it, there's maybe an indirect relationship through a child's friend or something like that, but even that I think is fairly rare. What I'm suspecting, and again, it would be interesting to actually study this more thoroughly, is that in the cases that you talk about, those hundreds of cases, and many of which involving adults, that these are just random adults just, you know, behaving badly online. And of course, we know there are a lot of adults that engage in these behaviors, and our research focuses almost exclusively on youth, but we get contacted probably weekly, probably more than weekly, from adults who are being targeted. I can't say we've been contacted by adults who admit that they've been targeting others, especially kids, but it just shows you the culture, the attitude. I mean, there's a lot of really bad things going on in society right now, and when we talk with parents and educators about kind of the animosity online and the disagreements that people have, we try to encourage them to be good role models. And look, you and I might disagree on something or vote for different people or who have different perspectives on certain issues, but that doesn't mean we have to target each other with hate, right? We can still have a thoughtful conversation about the issues. And I think disagreeing with somebody civilly is a skill and one that should be modeled by adults. But when we have these instances where adults are targeting other adults, but especially targeting kids, to me, that's just beyond the pale, and we should take those incidents more seriously.
I'll jump in just briefly and say, I often think about what is the reasons for this, and I think about, when it comes to human nature, we desire mastery or control over our circumstances, and the circumstances that have come down the pike in the last year have been ridiculous and insane and unprecedented, and yet we're still looking for some sort of way to understand, to come to grips with it, to reconcile it with our lives, with how we desired to live over the last 12 months, and it's just impossible. And so, still with that desire for control and for that desire for understanding, we look for scapegoats. And I think that when it comes to coronavirus fueled hatred towards specific groups, I think that's just an easy scapegoat that allows some individuals very easily to come to grips with the heavy emotions they're facing because their freedoms have been robbed from them in different ways, or they've struggled because they've lost a job, or a loved one has gotten sick. And so you're trying to reconcile that. You're trying to negotiate all of these heavy emotions and stressors. And so the easiest thing might be to just identify a scapegoat and pour out animosity towards that Justin alluded to.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think it's to your point too, Justin, about the role model we can play shows you that the heavy responsibility that anybody with a public platform has to be that role model, or the reverse is the damage that can be done when you don't handle that platform responsibly. I think this is, in fact, what we might be seeing. It could be random. It could be that the adults aren't necessarily targeting the kids. They're just seeing people who they think are responsible for their current situation, for their, as you call it, Samir, their the stress that they're under. I'm really hoping that the movement to the hashtag Stop AAPI Hate, Stop Asian Hate. I really hope hate of all kind towards any groups of people will be something we'll continue to fight for long after the pandemic, and not because of some tragedy that has taken place. I think we'll see. I think humanity's being put to a test right now. So hopefully we can all commit as an audience and as practitioners in this space to do that. So thank you for your perspective on it. I think that it's still so raw and still so new. And I look forward to the research that you continue to do in this area to say, what just happened?
Yeah,
just happened, and what can we learn? Yeah.
Related to that is, I see that Ann Collier posted a question, our colleague who does amazing work in the area of online safety. She asked, do you interface much with workplace or adult bullying groups and researchers? So I just wanted to quickly answer that because it's so relevant. Number one, youth-based bullying and cyberbullying is studied way more often because it's easier to get a sample of that population as it is to get entree into various organizations and then work with adults. So what we're doing at the International Journal for Bullying Prevention, which I help co-edit, we are trying to solicit more and more research because we know that it's necessary, focused on adults. And then secondarily, we are receiving more inquiries from HR departments at various organizations asking for help related to bullying, related to cyberbullying. And of course, they want us to touch on the DEI type of aspects because they're seeing that it's causing all forms of stress and breakdowns in mental health and compromising of well-being. So this is just something that I think we're going to have to continue to devote resources on. I know that President Biden just released a new fact sheet that conveys about all the things that they want to do at the federal level related to Asian American hate and the support that we can provide, not just symbolically, but substantively. And so my hope is that all of this is this touchstone moment, which will really sort of springboard us forward.
Yes, I hope so too, because I think what you've been doing already and the concept of you all applying that towards adult behavior and workplace bullying in particular, I think would be hugely, obviously highly needed, heavily needed and highly demanded. And, please let us know when you get to that point for sure. I want to turn quickly to how we can guide parents here today, both in terms of response and resilience, whether their child is a victim of hate or bullying, or whether their child is a bystander to it. And so let's start first with if your child was subjected to bullying or hate, what is your advice to parents whose children may experience this or have experienced this?
Well, I would say to begin with, don't wait till it happens. And so if this hasn't happened, if you have children and this kind of thing hasn't happened that you're aware of, take this opportunity later in the day today or very soon to sit down and chat with them about what they might encounter online or at school when they're interacting with others, to set up that line of communication so that they know that you know that these kinds of things happen, and then they'll know that you're willing and open to have conversations about it. I think from our research, we know that children are reluctant to discuss these issues with their parents or other authorities. I think about a little more than half of the tweens we surveyed were willing to tell their parents, and I think only about a third of the middle schoolers and high schoolers were. So we really, as parents, need to be proactive. I wrote a blog post not long ago talking about my own experience with my own son and how I've been preparing him. He's a fifth grader. I've been preparing him since he was a kindergartner. And every day I would pick him up from school. I would ask him, is there any bullying today? And it was really kind of conspiratorial and, daddy needs new research, right? And so every day I would ask him that. And at some point it got to be like old and dad joke. And so I stopped doing it every day, and I would do it regularly though. Well, not long ago, when I picked him up from school, he said, what do you usually ask me? And I said, well, was there any bullying today? And he said there was. And he had written a note about what had happened, and it didn't involve him directly, but it involved a classmate. So he was basically a bystander. And he wrote the whole thing down, so he wouldn't forget it. And then he explained it to me, and everything was handled, just fine by the school and his classmates and things. But so lay the groundwork for that kind of a conversation, especially if you have younger children, but also empower them. So I know we as adults sometimes don't fully understand the technology that they're using, but spend some time on those apps, in those games, and you can even be interacting with them or playing those games with them so that they know how to block somebody, how to report somebody, how to mute somebody, how to gather evidence of hate or abuse within that particular environment, whether it's a screenshot or saving messages or direct messages or whatever, so that if it does happen, they know how to respond in the moment. Maybe you're not there to help them, so they know it's important that they do keep the evidence if it does need to go to the authorities. So taking a screenshot is really important, but also how to stop that in the moment by blocking or muting or reporting. And so those are relatively simple tools. And then of course, if the behavior does impact your child at their school, like if it's a classmate who's doing it or there's some threats directed towards the school, it is important to get the school officials involved and make them aware. And sometimes kids are reluctant about that. It's embarrassing, right? They don't want to be the one whose parents goes to school and says that they're the one who's being bullied. But I can tell you and Samir would say the same thing, from talking with thousands of educators across the country, that they want to know. They want to know so they can do something about it, and they can't help if they don't know about it. So find the right person at the school. It might not be the principal. It might be a school counselor. It might be somebody who's tasked with dealing with these issues. But so all of this sort of centers around the idea of being prepared before this stuff happens, so that when it does happen, you can respond more meaningfully in the moment instead of being in a panic and not having considered these things.
Sorry, Samir, would you like to add anything?
I always think about just being calm and reasonable. And my emotions would be incredibly inflamed if my daughter came to me and said, someone's making fun of me because I'm Indian. I would just get incredibly upset about that, because immediately I would think of all the instances in my own past where I've been made fun of because of being Indian. And so I just feel like even in those moments, I need to stay very level-headed and very, very calm, because if I demonstrate even through body language that I'm getting emotionally agitated, then it's very possible that my child will not want to come to me when it comes to these sorts of issues in the future.
I would also add,
you.
I would also add to that, Lynette. I mean, studying bullying was a lot easier before we had kids. I mean, I think it's helped us. I mean, particularly mine being a tween, and Samir's will get there eventually. We look at it from a different perspective. It's one thing, obviously we have empathy towards all the targets that we, correspond with, and it's not just data, but when it's your child and you're seeing it right there in your face, it's more difficult to deal with, and it's harder to be detached and be academic, but it does sort of raise it to a whole new level.
Yeah, and I think the advice of being prepared, I know even just parents asking yourself, what would you do if your child came home one day and said this happened to them? Just thinking about that question, and maybe even jotting down, this is what I would do, how I might speak to my child about it, or whatever. I think it's a really good idea to not, and hopefully you'll never have to pick up that piece of paper you wrote it on ever again. But the other thing I know you know from your research, is that it's more likely a child will witness this happening to somebody else rather than somebody on the receiving end of it. Is that a true statement? They're more likely to witness it than actually experience it. And so I get asked a lot of this, I get this question a lot, which is, how do I be an ally? In the case of an Asian American classmate who might be, or an African American classmate, or whoever, someone for whatever reasons is being targeted, what do I do? How do I tell my kid to be an ally?
I mean, we don't want them to just, for example, take out their phones and record it so that they can upload it to social media and have it go viral. Or even if they have good intentions and they record it for the digital evidence part of it all. We want them to make sure that their hearts have been implicated so that they do something meaningful to care about the targets. Now, in a perfect world, yes, we would love for the bystander to become an upstander and immediately intervene or immediately go get help. But sometimes, and I think this is just real, they freeze and they don't want to. And so it's hard to get them to do something in that moment. But all we hope for is that eventually, hopefully pretty soon after, they do something, whether that's check in with the target to make sure the target's okay, go help directly to an adult and see what can be done about this. And then also, of course, we've talked a lot about how, we don't want youth to be involved in these behaviors. We don't want adults to be involved in these behaviors. But what can those youth do? What can those adults do in their schools and workplaces to make it more inclusive, to make sure that everyone does feel welcomed? And how can we get all stakeholders in each of those environments on board? I mean, that's kind of what I would want to see happen in those situations.
And I would also say that, again, preparation is key, right? So having those conversations with your children so that they know what to do, and then can pass that information on to maybe someone they see who is being targeted, or giving them suggestions for what to do when they observe the behavior. And they might not feel safe directly intervening, particularly in a physical altercation, but there are things they can do in terms of monitoring and reporting it to an adult they trust, and providing support to the person who's being targeted, after the fact. But practicing these kinds of things with your kids, especially younger kids, doing some role playing, giving them some scenarios, maybe even taking some of these examples, in many cases, these horrific examples we've been hearing in the media in the last couple of days about attacks and Asian motivated attacks, and having conversations with your kids about these kinds of situations and what they would do if they saw that happening. How would they respond? And the more you practice these things, I think the better it'll be in the moment, if that moment comes.
Yeah, I think that the more you're in conversation with your kids on a regular basis in general, you start to hear that something has transpired. And when your child is coming to you and saying, oh my gosh, guess what happened at school today, right? Or guess what happened on Instagram and so on. It feels like that's a moment where they're wanting to share, but they're actually seeking counsel? Is there something else they should be doing? Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, they don't want to be the rat. They don't want to be the snitch. They're just kind of sharing, and that's your opportunity to swoop in and not save the day, but at least provide some insight. Exactly, just sort of, oh, so did you think about doing this, or how'd that make you feel, or just kind of probing a little bit. And that can be tricky if you've never really thought about these issues. And I suspect the people who are logged in and watching right now have thought about these issues. So everybody here is ahead of the curve compared to most adults. But still, in the moment, try not to, solve their problem right away. Instead, sort of move towards allowing them to figure out how to deal with it. I mean, obviously, as adults, we need to step in some situations, but absorbing as much as you can, listening as much as you can, and try to get as much information as you can to help guide them. Because you're right. I mean, if they're coming to you, they're looking for help. I mean, otherwise they wouldn't have even brought it up. So this is definitely an opening that you should take advantage of.
Related to that, I posted in the chat window for all of you. Number one, we've written 23 scenarios that cover a gamut of various forms of abuse and victimization online. And the research shows that, again, working with your students through these role-playing scenarios will be very beneficial because it causes them to formulate an action plan of what to do when they're caught up, either as the target or as a bystander. And then secondly, Justin alluded to this, it's kind of hard to figure out what to ask. So we created a document for parents called something like questions parents should ask about technology, when it comes to their kids. And so please do check those out. Everything on our website is free, all these PDFs that are research informed and research based and very practical. And so hopefully they help towards that end. Oh, and real quick, I'll say the scenarios, at least a couple of them tie into race-based or ethnicity-based or religious-based bullying. So it's all very relevant.
Yeah, this is fantastic. And we will be sure to provide these links on our website as well, pointing directly to your site and all the great resources that you have there. I think responses of all kinds, being prepared in all ways, constant communication and conversations with our children, these are all very practical things that anybody could do today. There's one more that I think is maybe a little bit harder to practice, only because you can talk about it, but may not actually have to employ it unless it happens at some point. And that's this concept of resilience. So even though our child, if they were victimized, or even if they were witnesses of hate or bullying, there are actions they could take. As you say, report, come to you, stand up for the person being victimized, stand up for oneself, block. But even after taking those actions, there might still be some less visible pain and that children might be feeling, whether they're the victim or the person witnessing. I can see trauma happening for even kids who witness these kinds of things. So how do we also help our children build resilience in those situations? I know there's a great model that you talk about and we talked about in the past, but I think it bears repeating because, again, hopefully we never have to use it, but it's always good to talk about it again and again, just so we're ready.
Sure. I'll take a stab at that. When I think about resilience, we're just thinking about the ability to overcome adversity, and adversity is a part of life, increasingly so as we get older. Unfortunately, we're so exhausted from having to face adversity on a weekly, daily basis. So obviously, all of us would agree as parents, we want to be able to raise children who have a social and emotional skill set or tools in their toolbox to deal with conflict, to deal with these forms of relational strife. And if we keep sort of swooping in and rescuing them when they're in elementary or middle school, maybe even high school, when they're dealing with conflict, then they never really are able to practice these skills, just sort of try out to see, hey, will this work or will that work to deflect or to de-escalate? We've got to give them some sort of environment in which they can learn and practice resilience, because resilience is built not through the avoidance of risk, but through successful engagement with it. So with all that said, you mentioned a model, and I think probably you mean the ABC model, Adversity, Beliefs, and Consequences by Albert Ellis and some other scholars from University of Pennsylvania, like Martin Sigelman. What that's all about is that when you and I face adversity, we often immediately in our mind, we adopt certain messages or certain ways of explaining it away. And that just helps us to come to terms with it. And so those messages, though, they're on repeat in our mind and they quickly spring up in our subconscious and they happen over and over again. But some of them, unfortunately, are not healthy. They're not healthy ways of interpreting the situation or looking at things. And the example that I share when I speak about resilience just involves, let's say that you're a teenager and you see on Instagram, actually, no, let me not use that example because let's talk about race-based bullying. Let's talk about ethnicity-based bullying. So somebody makes fun of you because, you're Indian, you're Jewish, you're Muslim, you belong to one of these sort of minority categories, and it seems like everyone else is in the majority. Well, in those situations, you want to demonstrate resilience, but number one, you're probably going to feel it deeply. And number two, you're wondering who can actually help me because it seems like other kids are maybe ganging up on the same sort of sentiment and it just feels unbearable. So in those situations, we want to believe that our youth can look for help, but personally, individually, they want to be able to call it out. They want to be able to say, okay, that's unacceptable for these reasons. And one of the ways I think is useful in doing that is if the other person is largely not going to be willing to have an intelligent conversation about, personal sensitivities that we all have and how we need to stay away from, these identity type issues and accept everyone. But we still want the individual who is being targeted to be able to feel confident in themselves when it comes to their self-worth, where they receive their identity from, their value from, to be able to stay strong and to be able to speak out against it. It's tricky. And we hope, though, that as they continue to speak out, either in that moment or immediately after, they feel more and more emboldened to be who they are in their own skin, comfortable in their own skin, empowered in their own skin to stand up for what's right. So hopefully that helps to some degree.
Yeah, this is where the role of allies can be really critical in terms of not solving it for the person being victimized, but making the person being victimized feel like if I stand up for myself, I know I'm not alone. I know I'm not alone. And so I think for those of us who have children that aren't necessarily, again, we're more likely not going to be victimized, but be witnesses to it. We should be encouraging them to be that good upstander, to be the ally. It may even be someone they're not close friends with, but they can still, say privately, let's say in Instagram messaging, just ignore that person. They don't know what they're talking about.
And what has always helped me, and then I want to hear from Justin, of course, what has always helped me is, as a parent, I want to make sure that my children, as they get older, are not deriving their self-worth from peer perceptions, because that is so mercurial. It's like a roller coaster. And so, yes, it is amazing when you feel loved and you feel so popular in your school or in your online social media context, etc. But if you're deriving so much value and self-worth from that, you're setting yourself up to then be completely crushed when it goes away. And so when we give when we give others the power to validate us with regard to what they're saying, we've also given them the power to invalidate us. And so honestly, none of our self-worth should be coming from what other people are saying positively or negatively about us, whether it's related to our physical appearance, our intellectual capabilities, our grades, the clothes that we wear, our race, our religion. I mean, none of that should make us feel better about ourselves, and none of it should make us feel worse about ourselves. We have to compartmentalize it. Well
said. I think adults could really take heed of that advice, Samir. I want to just bring up one last thing, and then we've got some questions coming in, and I just want to briefly touch on this. I don't necessarily want to end on a bad note, but I just very, very briefly, if you could comment on this case in Pennsylvania, for those who are not familiar, where a mother, I don't even know the background for the reasons, but it seems like she was avenging her daughter in some way, who was on a cheerleading squad, who left a cheerleading squad, who took images of one of the girls on that squad, used deep fakes to make it look like that girl was behaving in ways that were unbecoming, and tried to do it without being discovered, but then was discovered, right? So here's the complexity. It's an adult bullying a child, a peer of her daughter. It's an adult using technology that we have not seen widely used yet, deepfakes, but could be widely used in the not too distant future to cause somebody else harm. So the question is, what are the lessons that we can learn from this? And, what are you focusing on in your research going forward, if anything, because of this case?
Sure. So for the last handful of years, all of us have seen the word deepfakes, whether it pops up in a news report or on social media. It's just one of these buzzwords that has gained a lot of traction. Maybe we've taken the time to figure out what it means, or maybe we haven't, but kind of, just to give a little bit of background, what's happening with deepfakes is that you can use software that's freely available online to analyze a corpus or a body of, let's say, images or videos, learn from all of those, let's say thousands, hundreds of thousands of them, and then from all the intelligence that's gathered through, an algorithm or multiple algorithms looking across that body of data, again, images or video, you're able to then doctor or modify another image to make it look like, to fabricate something. And in this case, we had a mom, this mom in a community in Pennsylvania, who, like you mentioned, seemingly wanted to avenge her daughter, who used to be on a cheerleading squad, an extracurricular club after school, where a bunch of other girls were as well. And so she used software in order to make it seem like those other girls who are still part of the cheerleading squad or club were smoking or drinking or vaping, some of those sorts of behaviors. Oh, also nude or partially nude. Not the sort of image that any of those girls would want to portray, not the sort of image that the cheerleading club would want to have associated with the entity. And so, yes, she was eventually discovered because her personal devices, they have unique hardware addressors, IMEI numbers, as well as IP addresses. And so then through the investigation, they found out that it's this woman. So the overall takeaway for me is that this story made national news. More and more people are going to look into this specific software and see how easy it is to use. And so I would suspect that we're going to see more and more cases of, in this, what we would call deepfake cyberbullying. But the cool thing is that my hope is that more and more tech companies will devote resources to this problem, because as the technology improves, the deepfakes are going to become more and more realistic. And you've seen deepfakes involving, for example, Tom Cruise or Barack Obama or Nicolas Cage. It wasn't an actual real image or video. It just seemed like it was, because these were fabricated images manipulated through technology to make it appear real. Well, we're going to see them used not in these comedic instances in order for a meme to go viral, but we're seeing them in these more nefarious instances, malicious instances. And I think it's just going to increase in prevalence. I'm not sure how much, maybe not a lot, because it takes a little bit of savvy to learn the tools and to make sure that it's relatively realistic to fool the individual, the human eye. So, we're just going to have to see.
Yeah, it is a tool. A tool is a tool. It's in the hands of those who use it. I think we have to worry about. And so we look forward to whatever research or even incidences that come across your center being reported to you over time. I can tell you it is something that Trend has been paying attention to for quite some time now. So perhaps there'll be yet another conversation a year from now where we can come back together and talk about how we tackle this issue. I think the final thing, before we turn to questions, is, kids are going back to school full time in greater numbers now, as the year, for some reason, towards the end of a school year is when they're deciding to do this, but it's happening at the younger ages. It's happening in greater numbers. Are you worried about this transition and what that might mean in terms of peer-to-peer interaction among youth?
Well, the one thing that comes to mind is that I'm trying to be hopeful, because we know that youth, when they struggle, when they look for help, the place that they go first is actually the school. And so now that they'll be able to see counselors and maybe chat with the teacher before or after, someone who hopefully they know deeply cares about them, then we'll have more conversation and we'll have more help being bestowed to those individuals. So that's the positive. In terms of negatives, I mean, I guess we will see. I really don't know how to speculate. My hope is that some of the dramas that might have bubbled up during on social media, let's say, maybe those could be quenched somehow through intervention of other individuals in quote unquote real life, other peers who are students, other adults who are watching over these interactions.
Yeah, I think Samir's right that, I mean, the school is the primary place of resources for most kids. And so that's where they're going to get the help from the counselors and others. But there is the potential for problems as kids move back to school. Their social networks have evolved a little bit. Their friend networks have changed. They haven't seen the people in certain groups. So there's going to be kind of the jockeying for social status, I think, and that in different people different kids will have had different experiences over the last year. And I mean, we see this as adults, right? And I'm constantly frustrated when I even see some of my own friends on Facebook who are out vacationing or out doing things that to me shouldn't be done during a pandemic. And so I think there could be some disagreement about that in terms of, you know, how you handle the last year. And some families might not have done anything different, where some have been holed up in their houses for the whole time, and that could create some animosity. So obviously, as researchers, we're going to continue following it and having conversations with kids and parents and educators to see how this plays out. But I think as parents, we need to be cautiously optimistic that obviously it's a very good thing that they're going back to school, but also be prepared for any potential problems that might occur.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we all have an adjustment and a transition to make in so many ways, but you know, our children deserve the support to make that transition, because everyone's going to go through different things at different phases at different times. So I do want to turn to we've got some great questions here. We have one regarding bullying in sports, even as early as first and second grade. The question is that sometimes there's trash talk during the games, but other than what coaches and parents can do to prevent bullying on a field or a court or an ice rink. That was for you, Justin.
I appreciated that.
Do you have any advice for building resiliency against this in sports?
Well, you know, we see the same thing with online gaming, right? Where the culture sort of encourages, you know, aggressiveness or trash talking or just interactions that could be viewed as bullying. And I think that's where it takes the I don't know, the role of the coach and or parent to make sure that those statements, those things that are being said, don't cross a certain line. And if your gut is telling you that something probably crossed a line, then maybe you want to check in with the person who is receiving the brunt of those comments. I mean, I know when I was growing up, you know, I was involved in sports and we would say a bunch of things to each other. And, you know, in hindsight, most of that stuff didn't bother me, but some of it did, right? And so how is an adult supposed to know the difference? I mean, at what point does it affect me on the field of play or with my relationships with my parents? And so I think as parents, we need to check in with our kids. And even if we're not observing the practice or the competition, asking them how things were and making sure that they're okay. I mean, if their behaviors change at home or at school as a result of the sports, then that's obviously a problem. But you know, it is, I think, important to look at those interactions in sport and online games. Anytime there's a competition, right? There's going to be we're going to be inflamed. It's going to be a heated disagreement. Things are going to be said, and so we want to make sure that that certain line isn't crossed, and that can be very, very tricky.
And then I would.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I would just try to keep bringing my child's attention to what they can control. We can't control what other people say. Even if the coach draws a hard line, that child could still say these awful things to my kid sitting next to them on the bench or wherever. And so since we can't control other people's behavior, I would just have my child continue to understand that in the world as they grow up, there's going to be haters, there's going to be smack talkers, there's going to be trolls, but all we can do is focus on our craft. For example, with Justin's in Justin's case and with Mark's case, his son, you focus on hockey, you focus on being the best teammate you can be, you focus on having the best slap shot, or whatever it is that you can control, and you try to drown out the naysayers or the people who are saying hurtful things. It's tough, but again, we can't presume that we're going to be able to protect them as they grow up from hurtful statements, from hurtful words, even if those statements are beyond the pale. And many times they are.
Yeah, and I think that's a sign of, if you are you sort of building up your children constantly, building up their confidence, telling them about the things they can control, what they're doing well around the things that they can control constantly. I think if they're hearing those messages, then the occasional, negative thing hopefully doesn't knock them down completely. Finally, hopefully they have allies on the team. And that is up to the adults actually to set the standard of what is or isn't accepted, what is or isn't a good teammate. There's actually a good exercise. I used to coach soccer, youth, not a professional. And having the children in the beginning of a season sit around and say, what are the words that describe a good teammate? And they have to write it. They have to think about it. And then they just have to look at it every time they're together, before a game or a practice, I think, and can engender that kind of culture. We have a few more questions here. I know we talked about ways to help our children respond to bullying. And this may or may not be a question about allyship or as a victim, but what are actually some examples of positive things my child could say in the moment when bullying or hate is happening? What are the kinds of things they could actually say? So let's take it from a allyship perspective. What could I say to the person being hurt?
I mean, yeah, I think it's all about conveying empathy, or at least, demonstrating that person that you're on their side, right? Because when it comes to adolescent bullying and kind of the social relationships and the status and the peer groups, the number one thing that any kid wants to do or to be is to fit in, right? And so if they're viewed as the outsider, if we're, all of us here are picking on you, then you're the outsider. But if others step in, like you say with that allyship, and say, no, I'm with her. I mean, she's the one who's, she's the good one, or there's no problem here. So I think demonstrating as much as you can that you're with them, and that can be really hard to do. It seems like a simple thing, but it can be really hard to do, because by me stepping out of everybody else and saying I'm with you, now I could be targeted, right? And so it does take a certain type of kid. It takes a kind of adult to do that too, because it's really tricky in the moment. If you've got a group of people saying one thing, and are you going to stand up to them for saying something that's inappropriate? It's really hard to do. So that's one thing. But also make it, I think it's important not to put too much pressure on our kids to be superheroes in the moment, because again, that is difficult. And you could put them into some uncomfortable situations. And so I guess just finding out from them what their level of comfort is in intervening in these kinds of situations. And maybe, for example, just one example, maybe your child has a really good sense of humor. And so maybe their way of intervening is telling a joke to kind of break the mood, or try to deflect the person from saying those things. Finding out whatever skills your child has and taking advantage of them to kind of intervene in that moment, versus putting them in a situation where expecting them, for example, to physically intervene and, punching that bully in the nose, where most kids aren't going to be able to respond in that way, and probably shouldn't. So figuring out what their tools are and their skills are, and basically exploiting them for that particular purpose.
I'd also say that because of the pandemic, research is very clear as it studied youth mental health and well-being, that the levels of isolation and loneliness are kind of at an all-time high when it comes to youth and the short amount of years that they've lived. And so when they're coming back into the school environment, I would just want all individuals with a platform, whether you're an educator or a coach or a parent, to be able to convey to youth that, look, it is really up to you. You have so much agency and power in this situation, to demonstrate, like Justin said, empathy, to help us build a positive school climate, to be all about belongingness and connectedness, so that everyone knows that we're all in this together and people don't feel like they're still on the fringes, even though we've started school again.
Absolutely. And I think it is our responsibility as the adults in the room to, pay close attention to this transition that our children will be going through over the next several months. It's good news around the Pfizer vaccine now as being effective for children down to the age of 12. So we know that the day is coming, the new school year will mean something closer to what we had before the pandemic began. We've had lots of questions that I might send to you to answer, and we'll try and get answers to those who asked them. But we are out of time. We could probably have spoken for another 2-3 hours on this topic. We really appreciate both Dr. Patchin and Dr. Hinduja for joining us today, and to all of you who have been listening intently to this really important conversation at a critical moment in society. All of our sessions are recorded. Today's conversation has in fact been recorded and will be posted at internetsafety.trendmicro.com. We encourage you, when you leave today's session, to complete the survey. It's very, very short. Give us some feedback. Tell us what topics you'd like to hear about in the future. And if you're one of the people who do enter, 5 of you may be selected to win a copy of Trend Micro Maximum Security, which is good for a year subscription, covering up to 5 devices in your home. With that, I'd like to, again, thank you, Justin. Thank you, Samir. Thank you, Noel. And thank you, Veronica, for supporting us today. And to all of you in our audience, we encourage you to again, look up the resources, the recording of this session, and all of the resources that were shared with you today in the chat will be posted at that website, internetsafety.trendmicro.com. We will see you on April 14 for our next session, and all of the details will be posted there.